This is a very important day in the life of the university. We are inaugurating a speaker series in honor of one of our most prestigious and most dedicated faculty members, Alan Sack. This speaker series was made possible by Larry Flanagan, who's joining us right here. Larry, thank you. And I should probably clarify for our students, by made possible means not just today, but Larry has endowed, meaning put a substantial sum of money into our endowment, into permanent funds, so that every year we can bring back a speaker like Dean Lombardi to talk to audiences like you. So Larry's responsible for something that will be here hopefully for thousands of years, if we can think in those terms. Larry is a graduate of the class of 1980. And was a marketing guru during his career with many prestigious organizations. Most recently, he was the chief marketing officer at MasterCard, and many of you, and there's no generation gap, know him through the most famous ad campaign probably in history, the Priceless campaign. That was, as they say, Larry's baby, which made a lot of people very successful, including him, and very well known globally. He's currently a member of the Board of Governors. He served on the board prior to this term and in between. In case you don't know, Larry was the executive dean of the College of Business, and it's wonderful that he still talks to us after having had that job. Faculty know what I mean. So Larry, thank you for your service to the university, and thank you for endowing this important speaker series. There are a few other sponsors of today's events. Our primary sponsor for this particular speaker is Octagon, the global sports, entertainment, lifestyle marketing, and talent representation agency. Also supporting the event today are the chairman of our board, Phil Bartels, and for me, more importantly, his son, Chris, because Chris is a recent graduate of the sports management program and is now working in the baseball commissioner's office in New York. Also sponsoring this is a board member, Rosa Gotti, who used to be the Chief Information Officer at ESPN, along with David Beckerman, whose name I hope our students know, who's the former CEO of the sports apparel company Starter. And finally, the Silverman Group, a New Haven marketing and advertising agency whose clients include the Orange Bowl, the NBA, and the NFL Players Association. The Alan Sack Lecture Series on Sports and Society honors a man who has long been one of the nation's leading voices in the crusade to protest student athletes, to protect, right, Alan? You should have caught that. To protect. He's a protester, too, as we know. To protect student athletes against the threats of commercialization and exploitation. The series also honors a man, Alan, who has spent a career educating thousands of UNH students, shaping young lives as much as he has shaped public discourse. Alan's research and writing focuses on the internal contradictions that emerge when universities, through sports, become a staging ground for mass commercial entertainment. Quote from Alan, "I am personally committed to the notion that the purpose of higher education is not to create athletes, but well-educated citizens whose educations are enhanced by competitive sports." As the name of this series suggests, Alan's work touches on broad themes. He sees sports as a prism through which to study larger issues such as racial segregation, gender equity, labor relations, marketing, management theory, politics, economic development, and higher education. Over the years, Alan and his colleagues in the sport management department have brought to campus many leading scholars, athletes, and sports executives to enrich the academic enterprise and to mentor our students. This series is yet another example of that tradition. It is a fitting tribute to Alan as a celebration of his 40 years at the university, and sadly on the occasion of his retirement. Sadly for us, not for him. Good move, Alan. I'm looking forward to my own. We are fortunate that Alan has found his home at UNH 4 decades ago. We're fortunate that he established the sports management program. And Alan, I don't know if you remember, but it was walking into this auditorium for a Bartels Fellow my first semester here that I first met you, and that you first told me about the founding of the sports management program, and reminded me that you're a sociologist, not a business person. And Alan, of course, grew this program into, along with his colleagues, into one of the finest such programs in the world. We have international ranking. He's brought the program and the university recognition through his publications and countless media appearances, and he's inspired a generation of students who have gone on to make their own mark on the world of sports and beyond. One such former student will be delivering today's inaugural Alan Sack Lecture. Dean Lombardi was a student of Alan's, graduating from UNH in 1982. He has since become one of the most successful executives in the National Hockey League. Here now to more formally introduce Dean, our speaker, is our very own Alan Sack. Alan?
Well, good morning. It is morning. Oh my God, I haven't been in front of a big classroom in, a couple of months, and it's kind of cool. I'm going to miss this, but hey, you retire. What a tremendous honor to have Dean Lombardi to be the first speaker in this endowed speaking series. And it's not like we hadn't tried before to get Dean to come to campus. For probably 20 years, we had made gestures like this to Dean. He's a hard-working guy. He's out in California. I went out to see him a couple of weeks ago, and I realized that it's not easy to pick up and just fly across the country and then fly back and then do your job at the same time. It is not easy. So we really appreciate right now even, you're doing your job. By the way, when the people in development asked me who my first choice was for the first speaker in this series, there was no doubt immediately Dean Lombardi was my first choice. Where are the people? That's the first one I mentioned. How ideal. One of ours. You know, this is a graduate of the University of New Haven, has reached one of the highest points you can reach in the sport management and in the sport industry. At the University of New Haven, he was an excellent student. He was graduated third in the class, I think. Second in the class. I'm sorry. A political science major. And I want to mention, while I was out in visiting, we went out to dinner 2 nights. And believe it or not, we didn't talk about sports. We talked about international foreign policy. We talked about the Vietnam War. We talked about just a wide breadth of things. And so obviously, I figured he must have learned something at the University of New Haven in that political science course. Is Natalie Farringer here right now? So, okay, I'm sorry she's not here. Because when Dean was talking, he said that the professor that had the greatest impact on his life was Natalie Farringer, and I wish she could be here so we could honor her as well. Very serious. In the middle of our discussions about the war in Vietnam, we start talking about honest. Hegel, the famous philosopher from Germany. We talked about Marx. We talked about the difference between dialectic materialism and Marx. And I said, who the hell did you learn that stuff from? He says, Natalie Farringer. So obviously, for a long time, this university has been doing a great job in educating its undergraduates and its graduate students. He went on to Tulane University. Largely, I think that he was encouraged by Natalie Farringer to do that. Tulane got his law degree in labor law. Not a bad place. Very, very prestigious school. He then went on to be a player's agent, worked himself into the front office of the Minnesota Lone Stars, right? Yes. Then he off to the San Jose Sharks, and I remember following him through this period. I was still on the phone calling him all the time, please, would you come out and be a speaker at the University of New Haven? Very busy. He worked hard. He brought the San Jose Sharks to a much higher level of competition, and because of his tremendous leadership skills. Then on to the LA Kings, 2 Stanley Cups within the last 3 years, seen as one of the finest general managers in the country. And this is a University of New Haven graduate, all right? And I'm so proud that he has come here and that he's become the first speaker in this lecture series. And what I'd like to do now is just, I wanted to mention that I think he's kind of an intellectual. I don't think you like that be called an intellectual, but you are because you're questioning, you're constantly pushing ahead. But he's not an intellectual in the usual sense. You talk about a paralysis by analysis. He doesn't. I watched him in action. He allowed me to come into some of their meetings, and I watched the way they make decisions about players. You cannot just keep on pausing and wondering and debating like we do as faculty. You have to make a decision, and he's the decision maker. There's no doubt about it. I saw him there, and respect that staff had for him, and the kinds of difficult decisions they make on a daily basis. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn things over to Dean, and he can talk a little bit about his life and some of his values and his view of the world. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, the only thing about this job is you can go on Twitter and find out what an idiot maker, decision maker I am. Is Dr. Farringer here by any chance? No? Okay. First of all, I would like to thank the University of New Haven for inviting me here today to be the first speaker and the first endowed Alan Sack lecture on sport and social issues. This is the first time that I've been back to New Haven in almost 30 years. But it's arguable that in terms of my professional career, I found my sense of direction inside the walls of this institution. Essentially, there are two reasons. One, I had no choice. It was very early in my tenure at UNH that it was becoming decidedly clear that I was not going to be a professional hockey player in the National Hockey League. But second, and most important, is I was blessed to have a teacher at UNH who took the time and showed the caring to provide the signposts that inspired me to find a sense of direction. In any lifespan, there are always singular people in your life whose influence defines who you are and what you become. People who demonstrate a bona fide interest in you as a person, a bona fide interest in finding what inspires you, and a bona fide interest in seeing that you become the best you can be once you decide what inspires you. So this return to the University of New Haven certainly reminds me of a distant past, but there is no doubt that a person from that past had a profound influence upon what I've become and remains a part of me to this day. To that end, I would like to recognize a person very special to me, a teacher, an advisor, an influence, and an inspiration at a critical time in my life. And most importantly, it was the person who gave the greatest gift that a teacher can give a pupil. She was the first teacher to open my mind on what it means to think. Not how to think, which is indoctrination, but the mental stamina to investigate a premise, to have the capacity to formulate arguments on each side of the equation, and the conviction to form your own conclusions. It was a thought process that was planted in her classroom, cultivated in law school, and remains with me to this very day. So, to you, Dr. Farringer, wherever you are, thank you for your embrace, and always remember that a piece of that first Stanley Cup trophy belongs to you. Now, it might seem ironic or maybe fortuitous that while I will always find inspiration from the past at UNH, there is reason to find inspiration for the future. I was never a student of Professor Sack, although many of my friends in college spoke highly of his unique curriculum, his thoughtful or radical approach, depending upon your point of view, and his cool persona. The fact was that I thought I knew everything there was to know about sport since I was 6 years old. And additionally, I was never a Notre Dame fan and continue to root against them to this day. And having gone to school in the South, I know that real college football is only played in the SEC. So we are all aware that Professor Sack's teaching career, he spearheaded the drive to end the exploitation of college athletes which was becoming obvious from college athletics' singular pursuit of commercialism. It was because of his signature accomplishment that it is safe to say that every college athlete today owes Professor Sack a debt of gratitude. It was only through his tireless efforts that every athlete receives a 4-year scholarship. It was Professor Sack who had the guts to challenge the Goliaths of the NCAA and the hypocrisy of their essentially 1-year employment agreements, which guaranteed that an athlete's education would be a mere afterthought. But he did not stop there. He played a leading role in the creation of grassroots organizations such as CARE, with the aim of expanding sport as an institution for uniting impoverished communities. He brought awareness to the racism and sexism that pervaded the sporting landscape, advocating the use of sport as a unifier and not a divider. He brought awareness to the plight of college athletes who had suffered career-ending injuries, yet were denied workers' compensation benefits or medical treatment. And he pioneered a field of study, the sociology of sport, which has spawned copycat curriculums in colleges across the country and has garnered the University of New Haven national recognition as a leader in this field. But it's important to remember that Professor Sack stands as a role model not just because of his cause. Embracing a cause is only one part of the equation. Anyone can say they are for a cause, but a cause without action is ephemeral and doomed to insignificance. Whether or not one agrees with the cause, the if and manner in which that cause is pursued is always an independent grounds for evaluation. And it is safe to say that Professor Sack's commitment to the action portion of his cause is legendary and an example for us all. Whether sleeping on cots in a blighted section of Brooklyn, organizing conventions and speaking engagements, traveling to Washington to challenge the power brokers, writing books and articles, drafting a college athlete's Bill of Rights, there are values in these actions that go beyond the substance of his cause. They are the shining example of the values of commitment, sacrifice, selflessness, perseverance, and conviction. These are the tenets that transcend the cause and make him a role model for us all in whatever we challenge ourselves to pursue. These are the championship values not only of a team, but more importantly, of a human being. Now, sport has been a major part of my life since I was 6 years old. There is no question that the values I learned as an athlete are a major contributor to who I am today. And I've been involved in professional sports now for almost 30 years. And over this period, I began to notice a decided change in the landscape between the values that were instilled in me by sport and the values that were being instilled in our athletes today. About 3 years ago, I picked up Professor Sack's book entitled Counterfeit Amateurs. What was clear to me after reading the book was that the underlying issue that pervaded his cause and his action centered upon the issue of values. The valuation equation had changed in college sports, and the term student-athlete was merely branding. The values of commercialism were running roughshod over the traditional values of collegiate sport and the educational mission. In essence, Professor Sack's mission was to realign the value equation. Either college sports could reaffirm its traditional values, or it could continue down its path and define itself by what, in fact, its values represented: a minor league sports and free feeder system for the professional sports leagues. Like Professor Sack, I began to look closely at the valuation equation evolving in professional sports, to use the spirit of Professor Sack's analytical framework to examine these values, to examine their potential impact upon a broader society, to consider whether sports reflect society or society reflects sports. Questions that I now believe are critical to the future of sport. More than any other time in our country's history, I believe sports is at a crossroads. Will it be an institution whose values are worthy of transcendence an adoption by a broader society, or will it be an institution whose values are unworthy of higher ideals and must be isolated from the broader societal plane? So in the tradition of Professor Sachs' courage to investigate and challenge disturbing trends, and a touch of Dr. Farringer's Socratic mode of inquiry, I would like to share with you some of my experiences to date in professional sports and consider them for evaluation of one of our country's most influential institutions. Firstly, I think that in seeking to examine the purposes and values of any institution, it might be helpful to ask the macro question of what category that institution may or may not fit into. Then one can outline the goals, design a methodology, and determine the values that are necessary to succeed in that category. So what category does sport fall within? Well, some people would say that sport is a business. With the mega player contracts, record franchise values, billion-dollar television contracts, infinite marketing, that hypothesis seems to ring true. But let's look at the game of business and see if its rules reflect the values of sport. In business, the scoreboard is money. Winners are defined by how much money they make. Money is the end game. Money is cause and effect. In business, an employee's number one goal oftentimes is to find a way to get ahead, achieve a promotion, supplant that person on the salary structure. Machiavellian game plans are as prevalent as the West Coast offense. Camaraderie be damned. In business, you can manipulate the scoreboard through clever marketing or dubious accounting methods. Basic cheating is good business practice. In business, you can jump ship at any time if times get tough. Send out your resume, call in some connections, or better yet, get yourself a golden parachute. Money is cause, money is effect. Does this sound like a breeding ground for the values of sport? Other opinion makers define sport as merely entertainment. Essentially, the players are just actors in a Broadway play, traveling around the country, providing a diversion for the masses. Well, let's look at that hypothesis. An entertainer makes his living on being someone or something he is not. The job requires him to portray tens of characters. If he tries to critique himself in the mirror, he doesn't know who the hell he is, and that's a good thing. He must actively seek fame and adulation. Self-promotion is a constant. Fame and money are cause and effect. Does this sound like a breeding ground for the values of sport? In my experience growing up with sport, fitting the values of sport into the values of business and entertainment would clearly be like fitting the proverbial square peg into a round hole. Sport was never intended to be a mere subset of business and entertainment. I would submit that the conclusion is simple. Sport was always meant to stand alone as an institution with its own set of values. A set of values not only for the athletic field, but more importantly for the field of life. But one must ask, are we creating an institution whose behavior and culture at the grassroots to the highest levels now induces values that merely mirrors the institutions of business and entertainment? Just as the student athlete has transitioned to the minor league professional player, has sport transitioned to the point where the cause and effect of its core ideals are a carbon copy of those of business and entertainment? Are many of the virtues that have traditionally been associated with sport in danger of becoming extinct by the institutionalization of a completely different set of values? This is the monumental question now confronting sport. And to that end, it might be helpful to examine a couple of the values that traditionally are associated with sport in some detail and then touch on a couple others at the end. Now, one of the values traditionally associated with sport, particularly at the grassroots level, is that sport was capable of cultivating bonds that spanned a lifetime. Let's call them everlasting bonds. Now, my involvement with youth sports was fairly typical during my generation. Most young athletes spent their entire amateur career playing for their local community teams that funneled them to the local high school. After high school, a few of the more talented players might be lucky enough to play in college. The extremely talented might be lucky enough to get a professional tryout. But inevitably, as an athlete moved up the ranks, the math equation became increasingly obvious. In hockey, for instance, only 600 people in the world are qualified to play in the National Hockey League. A stark reality eventually sets in. The chances of playing for one's professional team are as likely as getting struck by lightning. But while playing for local community teams, there was nothing wrong with every player dreaming the dream, even if we were ignorant of the fact that it was pure fantasy. For while we might have been living in a dream world, something far more important was happening in the real world. Playing with essentially the same players as we rose through the ranks together against the same competition from our towns and immediate area, we were forming relationships and learning valuable lessons that would last a lifetime. Today's young athletes and their parents are now the gullible victims of the age of specialization and elitism that has essentially destroyed sport and its meaning at the local level. The young player with just average athletic ability now becomes inundated with sales pitches of tournament organizers and coaches from travel teams that prey on young players' dream of being a professional athlete. These salesmen pull players from their local community, forcing them to abandon local teams by convincing players and their parents that specialty camps and travel teams are the ticket to the pros. They spew their gospel like an evangelist, offering the kingdom of riches, and clothe their mission with the disguise of volunteerism, while they pocket up to 6 figures for a weekend tournament. The only thing missing is a Don King haircut. The sad truth is that it is highly unlikely or arguably impossible that elite travel teams for Little League baseball players or minor midget hockey players can ever manufacture a professional athlete. No matter how much specialization and training a young player is exposed to, a career at the professional level of 4 major sports requires one critical element that no amount of training can manufacture. Only God, or for the atheist, stardust, can ever give the gift of superior athletic ability. The professional athlete's inherent athletic ability is as unique as the intellectual capacity of Einstein. It is one thing to pursue a dream. It is quite another to become hostage for a lie. And it comes at an enormous social cost. Families and players are held hostage on weekends, convinced they must get in their car, travel 5 hours to play in a tournament, or they will never be any good. The atmosphere that kindles lifelong relationships in local communities is destroyed as athletes and families become divided solely by virtue of their offspring's athletic ability. When we are still struggling to bring our communities together without regard to race, do we really need to divide our youth along the lines of athletic ability when they are not even 12 years old? And make no mistake, both the gifted athlete and his inferior brethren pay a price. The cost to the inferior. When the best players in the community are convinced that they must leave the inferior competition of the local community, it sends a message to those players left behind that they are not good enough and they are inferior. They learn a hard lesson that they do not need to learn at that age, that the dream cannot be true because they are only playing for their local team and not the elite travel team. Their energy to participate is zapped, and the opportunity to learn valuable lessons and form lasting relationships is gone. The cost to the elite, and make no mistake, that top player also pays a price. He inevitably becomes fodder for the elitism, looking down on those who were once his friends and teammates, who are now not even good enough to be on the same field as him. But again, this vain effort to achieve an essentially impossible goal comes at another social cost. He does not learn to lead and encourage those players that are less talented than himself, to recognize that team is an inclusive concept which requires you as the best player to embrace that 4-foot-tall second-string catcher with the Clark Kent glasses because you need him to achieve a common goal and not abandon him because he is not good enough. And down the road, that Clark Kent just might be your best friend. And that top player might as learn now, because as he moves up the ladder, he too will reach the status of that second-string catcher. I know. I remember when I was in Little League and I was one of the best players on the team. I was pitching a shutout. The game was well in hand, and the coach put in the second-string catcher with the Clark Kent glasses. I had trouble getting the ball over the plate. The first-string catcher was a much bigger target. And when I couldn't get the ball over the plate because of the small target, I showed him up. As soon as that inning was over, the coach came up to me after the game, put his finger right in my face, and says, "That is not what a good teammate does to a fellow teammate. How would you like it if somebody did that to you? Don't ever let me see that again." Lesson learned. I realized that at some point, top athletes may need to leave their comfort zone and be challenged at a higher level. I left high school hockey my senior year to play in a much more challenging New England Junior Hockey League where we won a national title. But is it really necessary for young players 8 years old to be coerced into leaving their local neighborhoods and spending outrageous sums of money? The relationships I formed as a 7-year-old playing for my local hockey and baseball teams are still with me today. They would have never been formed under the current norm. I was a slightly above average athlete and probably would have got sucked into the elitist black hole. But what is particularly sad is that oftentimes the relationships formed during this period are the only real relationships one has in life. They are real because they are formed in an age when no one has an agenda. The relationship does not change by changing circumstances and thus has the potential staying power of being everlasting. I routinely return home, and the relationships I formed in local youth sports are instantly rekindled and will never die. Is it progress to inaugurate a system of specialization and elitism that fosters a lie that you are going to be a professional, where even the best players have only a minuscule chance of making it? The dream is not real, but the loss of community, togetherness, and relationship building is real and lost forever. Is it the players who have changed their values, or is it the institution that has changed its values and the players are merely adapting to the environment the institution is creating? Second value, loyalty. Loyalty has always been promoted as a premier value within the sporting fraternity. The term is everywhere in sport, or used to be. Loyalty to your team, loyalty to your teammates, loyalty to your coach, loyalty to your fans, loyalty to your city. However, one has to consider today whether loyalty still has its place in sport lexicon. Has the benefits of modern-day free agency come at a steep price? The evisceration of loyalty as a paradigm of sport. Now, it is certainly reasonable to conclude that a player should have the right to market his services to the highest bidder, as does any other potential employee in the marketplace. In the past, professional athletes were bound to one team throughout their career, which significantly diminished their earnings potential and bordered upon a glorified version of involuntary servitude. In the last 20 years, players rightfully leveled the playing field and receiving their fair share of the revenue pie. During the more immediate history, players have gained even greater free agent rights in return for a cap system that restricts the total amount of dollars that a team can pay. The most recognizable result of this system is that players now hardly ever spend their entire career with one team. But is there another result far less recognizable below the surface that is leading to the destruction of one of sport's signature values? Was it not possible to create a more intelligent system or to enforce the rules of the present system that would ensure that players receive their fair share without sacrificing the value of loyalty? In the institution of professional sport, we now see professional players routinely plot their free agency strategy a full 2 years prior to their actual free agent period. Agents are routinely marketing players to other teams in flagrant violation of the collective bargaining agreement with impunity. Additionally, the marketing scheme of the agents often includes a package deal where 2 or more players from different teams express their desire to play in the same city that has the requisite cap space. The agent drops subtle threats to the team's general manager that if he does not want to play ball and violate the rules, the team down the road in his division surely will. Despite the obvious illegality of these practices, teams readily engage these overtures, legitimately fearing that if they do not do it, their competitor will. Rampant tampering is now standard fare in professional sport. And like booze during Prohibition, there has never been a sincere effort by a law enforcement mechanism of sport to put a stop to the practice. League and unions, while condemning the practice publicly as a violation of the collective bargaining agreement, show no real interest in stemming the practice and even ignore the most flagrant violations. For example, take the NBA GM this past season, who in the midst of a disastrous season admitted to the media that agents were already contacting him for next year, expressing an interest in playing for his team. The obvious purpose of this admission was to assure the team's fan base that despite the circus act that was being performed by his team and the dysfunction that it implied, the fans could rest assured that top players still wanted to come play in his city. Well, something is backwards when a violation of a collective bargaining agreement can be used as a marketing gimmick. League officials should have immediately initiated a special prosecutor-type investigation, but there was nothing coming from the NBA league office condemning his flagrant admission. Even when the tampering is not obvious, the sight of Derrick Rose talking about his focus upon free agency a full 2 years before it is due just does not pass the smell test. And incidentally, this was in response to a question regarding a civil suit filed against him. I'm not sure how free agency ties into that. It is really hard to imagine that a player is dying for the colors and committed to his team and his city when he is granted amnesty to plan and pursue potential free agent option years well in advance of his right to do so. But the reason the practice is unrestrained is obvious from even a simple analysis of the interests. Every sector of the institution benefits from seeing the perpetrators go unpunished. The league encourages it because it ensures that the talent becomes evenly distributed so that it can achieve its cherished goal of parity. The union endorses it because it ensures the maximum use of industry-wide cap space. The media endorses it because it creates juicy tabloid content for its gullible audience. And the agent obviously endorses it because it allows him to see what else is available, engage it against what his current team may be offering prior to the free agent period. Thus, the institution as a whole encourages a violation of the rules that are designed to ensure that a player is committed to his team, that the player warrants the faith of the public that he is performing to the best of his physical and emotional abilities for the team. The concept of loyalty is now being systematically destroyed from every sector within the institution of sport. And not only is the value being destroyed, but when the means used to destroy it is knowingly illegal, the value of loyalty suffers from double jeopardy. Cheating becomes an institutionalized means in the sports industry to the end of destroying the value of loyalty. Unless the system was changed, there is a simple way to ensure that tampering would be significantly curtailed within the present system. If leagues and unions were to adapt a page from the IRS Enforcement Division, where teams would agree to random audits amongst all free agent signings with significant penalties, you can rest assured that compliance would increase tenfold. But then compliance would harm those numerous interests within the institution of sport who have to satisfy their own set of values. Is it the players who have changed their values, Or is it the institution that has changed its values and the players are merely adapting to the environment the institution has created? Third value, respect for authority. This is one area where me and the distinguished Professor Sack have a decided difference of opinion. But I can understand how this can happen when you are influenced by somebody from the Siamese Twins Liberation Army or whatever it was back in the 60s. Honestly, Professor, a Notre Dame football player advocating that players have the right to interview coaches. Are you kidding me? We have to watch politicians go through the dog and pony election cycle every 4 years, and now you want to bring it into every locker room into the country. But as Dr. Farringer says, I have to recognize and respect your counter-argument, so we'll save that for next time. Let's talk about what I believe the spirit of coaching was in the not-too-distant past. The distinguished former coach of the Dallas Cowboys, Tom Landry, once said that my job as a coach was to get the player to do what he does not want to do so that he can become what he wants to become. Is there anything in life that is worth pursuing that does not require you to do something at some point you do not want to do to get to the ends that you are seeking? I graduated third in my class in New Haven and graduated with honors from law school. Would I have rather been out at frat parties every night or drinking hurricanes, listening to the blues in the French Quarter? Sure. But it was not going to get me to where I wanted to go. I am convinced that it was on an athletic field that I learned of the need to push myself if I was going to accomplish what I desired in life. That extra rep in the weight room that made your arms burn, that extra sprint that made you want to puke, the last 50 wrist shots that made the calluses on your hands bleed. All embedded in you by a coach yelling in your ear, challenging you with metaphors not suitable for print. But once you were done, it was one of the best feelings in the world. It was no different than the feeling I had after putting in the time to ace one of Professor Farringer's exams. It was no different than the feeling I had after putting in the time to pass the bar exam. I learned to do what I did not want to do to become what I wanted to become. I learned at an early age to push through to the limit because I respected the authority of the coach. There was no way I was going to do that last sprint or that last rep in the weight room if left to my own devices. But there was one key factor in my respect for the authority of the coach. It was that deep down I believed that the coach I had was only interested in pushing me to be the best I could be for my own sake and not theirs. They were coaching for me and not through me. Have you ever seen a high-level AAA hockey game or AAA Little League game and watched some of these coaches? You might think they're Napoleon, barking at the top of their lungs to make sure they are the show. They are actually forming their identity on the backs of 11-year-olds. How many coaches from these elite camps that draw college recruiters and professional scouts? Are they there to coach, or is it about getting noticed for a potential job opening down the road? How about the message it sends college players? When the coaches are routinely making $6 million a year, get eulogized in the media, and the player gets room and board. And better yet, how about these college coaches' contracts that pay the college coach mega dollars, and then they have outs in them that allow them to leave at any time, which they routinely do. That will surely impress players that have respect for authority. Should he respect his authority? Even at the professional level, where clearly the coaches should know better, how many times have you seen a professional coach talking about the brilliance of his system and tactics and showing no hesitation to slip in the I word? I asked coaches a series of questions at a convention I spoke at that raised this very issue of their role as a coach. What is your real motivation as a coach? What are your goals as a coach? Are you coaching for your players or through them? Are you a role model for your coaches? Is your immediate ambition to be the best you can be as an end in itself, or to promote yourself above your players? Are you a great coach or a great self-promoter? Are you a great coach or a great opportunist? Are you a media darling? I would suggest that a lot of coaches at all levels today would have a difficult time with truthful answers to some of these questions. and thereby the player has a right to question his authority. How many college or professional players today would eulogize their coach like Vince Lombardi once eulogized Jerry Kramer once eulogized Vince Lombardi? I hated that bastard, but I would pick up and play for him in a millisecond because deep down I knew he was only trying to make me better. When today's players routinely challenge the coach's authority, whether it be playing time, being punctual for meetings, doing the extra rep in the weight room, or just showing basic respect, is the player's lack of respect for authority merely a reflection of their intuition that that coach only cares that the player perform well so that the coach can look good? If sport as an institution has lost its credibility for teaching respect for authority, I believe it is a great loss because it is simple. No matter how much of a libertarian you may be, the fact remains that respect for authority is necessary in any civilized society. Authority comes in all shapes and sizes. Authority for the teacher, respect for the authority of the police officer, the authority of the receptionist, the authority of the stewardess, the authority of the ticket taker, the authority of a red light. Our daily life is filled with situations where it cannot function unless there is respect for authority and the fact that somebody, in most encounters, has the position of authority. Respect for authority does not mean you cannot question authority, but to assume that there is a utopia where there is no authority is a complete pipe dream. Every time it has been tried, it has failed miserably, and you can start with Jamestown, Virginia. Now, there is no question that I learned respect for authority in the athletic environment. The respect I learned allowed me to be pushed and never quit when pursuing my goals. Sport was an institution that provided proof that respect for authority that has your interests in heart is critical towards achieving your goals. In a broader society, respect for well-intentioned and legitimate authority is critical toward avoiding the type chaos that can only be cured by force and totalitarianism. But if our coaches are becoming merely agents of self-promotion at all levels, then sport has lost its place as an invaluable institution for learning the value of respect for authority and the value of pushing yourself to do what you do not want to do so that you can become what you want to become. Is it the players who have changed their values, or is the institution that has changed its values and the players are merely adapting to the environment the institution has created? These are just a few examples of the changes in evaluation equation that is affecting sports at all levels. There are numerous others, and sometimes I get the feeling I could teach an entire course on this. But we'll touch on a couple more briefly. Accountability and honesty, always a signature value of sport. Does it teach a player to be accountable where a player, his agent, and the union are entitled to hide a drug problem from his team for years while his play steadily declines? And when the problem finally comes to the fore, the agent and the union are entitled to smear the team by diminishing the facts, knowing that the team cannot reveal the nature and extent of the real facts because of privacy rights. The team is defenseless, while the union and the agent purchase a cover-up with the media by promising future scoops on player movement in return for favorable press. That's how it works. The player and his brand are protected, and another pile of money for the player and fees for the agent. Does this sound like an institution for instilling honesty and accountability? Role models. Where is it written that professional athletes and the morality of Jesus are mutually inclusive? How is it that athletic ability automatically canonizes one as a role model? Professional athletes are human beings. They face the same challenges in regards to avoiding temptation, relationship frustrations, and personal failures as everyone else. And in a lot of respects, they are not equipped to deal with them because once they are identified as special talents at a young age, they are coddled, protected, and eulogized. The constant fawning and promotion reaches the point where the player legitimately believes he is invincible off the field as well as on. If the institution insists on making its players role models, should it not ensure that the athlete is thoroughly educated in meeting the challenges that come outside the playing arena? Are we really concerned about them as human beings and making them role models in fact? Do we want to make sure that every player can pass the Chris Aaron test? That if a 10-year-old asks you for an autograph and you were that 10-year-old, would you ask yourself for an autograph? Is the idea of anointing our athletes as role models really an honest humanitarian endeavor? Or is it just a marketing tool where we can churn them and burn them when they let us down? Self-sacrifice, always a pillar of sport. Consider a cap system that caters to players who unashamedly take 20 to 25% of the payroll, eliminating the amount payable to the middle class of players. A system that essentially turns player against player. There's a lot of similarity to what we are seeing in terms of income distribution in sport and what we see happening in society today. Maybe the middle class player needs to start its own union, just like the middle class in society may need to start its own political party. Now, I am not sure, I am aware that identifying the problem, if there is a problem, is significantly easier than finding a solution. But I believe that sport is too important to our society to not ensure that its traditional values are not completely derailed. In conclusion, let me leave you with one thought. I would like to cite one of the most inspirational quotes that I have ever read in sport and what I think is the real meaning of sport. And once again, it is from Vince Lombardi. He says, "I firmly believe that any man's finest hour, that greatest fulfillment of all that he holds dear, is that moment when he has worked his heart out with his brethren in common cause and lies exhausted on the field of battle victorious." I find this to be the most inspirational definition of the meaning of sport. But not only do I find it inspirational, more importantly, I know it's true. I know the feeling after winning 2 Stanley Cup championships. It was a state of euphoria you cannot describe. You get into a zone of metaphysical inebriation while hugging your teammates that you do not even remember. It was, in fact, the greatest fulfillment of all that I hold dear. I often thought afterwards why that feeling is so seldom replicated anywhere else in life. But then I remembered what a smart man told me a long time ago. He said, "Dean, true happiness is being happy for someone else. That happiness that doesn't have the slightest trace of envy." And that's what happens when you lie on a field exhausted after exerting maximum effort in common cause. That's what happens when you hug each other after a Stanley Cup championship win. You are truly happy for the teammate you are hugging. That's why you hear retired players, when their career's over, they're not talking about the money and their fame. They're talking about the camaraderie, the bonds that were formed by struggling together, the bonds that last a lifetime. If this happiness is in fact real happiness, and we embrace this notion, what would happen if each one of us took this quote to heart in whatever endeavor we wish to pursue? What would happen if in our families we worked our hearts out in common cause? What would happen if in our communities we worked our hearts out in common cause? What would happen if in our country we worked our hearts out in common cause? And what would happen if our world we worked our hearts out in common cause? Safe to say that if all of us applied one of sport's most signature mantras to our everyday life, this world would surely be a better place. Let's just pray that sport can still provide us with an example of this special gospel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean. What a wonderful way to launch this inaugural Alan Sack Lecture Series on sport and social issues. We have time for a couple quick questions. If there are any questions, we have Professor Mahoney with a microphone. So if you have a question, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. We'll try to allow a couple questions. I guess you baffled them all. Yes.
Hello. So I'm an accounting major, not a sports management, but I've been a humongous hockey fan forever. So my question is, like, when you make the trades and when you do other things like paying the salaries and stuff, what do accountants do, and how do you I don't know. Sorry. If you knew any of that, or if it's more, sorry. I'm a little nervous.
Actually, they have a much bigger role than they had when I started. For instance, we just had to do, it's funny how the lawyers and accountants now work hand in hand, and the hockey guys, go to the other room because it's getting so complicated. They just did a 20-year deal, for instance, that required all this valuation on present value and everything else. So, and that required, significant use of an accountant. So there is certainly a place for them. I'm not sure it's a daily occurrence. It usually comes into place when you're dealing with big deals like that. There is some crossover, obviously, understanding numbers and understanding the use of the cap. You can have people that come into the cap from the numbers side and learn the rules, or usually it's lawyers that learn the rules and learn the numbers side. So the avenue is much broader than it was in the past, and there's certainly a place for it, because I can't figure it out half the time, so you need that certain skill. So.
Next. This is how we get our workout, going up and down steps like this.
Hi. So my question is, so I want to touch back on when you talked about the NBA and Derrick Rose and the players talking to the media. I feel like a lot of that's caused because of they have such the media has such strong ties with the NBA and other sports with the NFL. Do you think because the NHL doesn't have as strong of media coverage as the NBA or the NFL that their values are more pure than?
Oh boy. Okay. When's the next lecture?
All right. Presentation's
We'll
over.
be back next week. We'll do it again. I've always said there's almost a 10-year lag time. It's actually why I spend most of my time. If I'm watching sports, I'll watch the NFL and the NBA more, because it's a leading indicator on what's kind of happening in our sport. We tend to follow everything they do, whether it's our system and then the impact of the media or whatever. So I can assure you that although it's not as pronounced as when you see a Derrick Rose talking about that, or it is clearly part of the NHL now. It is going on, as I said, rampant. As far as the media, the problem you got is, I'm not sure, I was just talking to a writer this morning, that how many real journalists are there in sport now? Like guys who really know how to write, right? You look at a Sports Illustrated now, and those guys got talent. You might not agree with them or anything else, but when you read the way they structure their stories, there's talent there. So much now today to be a good journalist is getting a scoop. That's the number one thing. It's like, how many followers do I got makes you a good journalist now. And essentially, that is based upon, it's almost if you can be the Howard Stern of sport and create buzz. I mean, you have these, it's incredible, like when you sit in my seat, and you'll say, the rumor is LA's trading Milan Lucic. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that goes on. You sit there like, what in the world? But then, because these guys are competing with each other, that now it's gotten to the point, it don't matter if you make it up. as long as it creates buzz and gets going, and that's a successful writer now, that put something out there, if it generates 500 hits, good job. So, and the other thing you got there now too, is don't forget, because you're so involved to the scoop side, that's where, if you watch, I always amazed when you watch some of these shows and the sport commentator go, oh, he's a good guy, he's a good guy, he's a good, to management, red flag. Because essentially that means you're giving probably scoops that you shouldn't be giving. The locker room is supposed to be a sanctuary. And it's none of your business what's going on in there. But so much of the media now is generated to get that inside scoop, get the dirt, get from management what they're thinking on trades. And so that's why you don't, if there's legitimate criticism of a player, you don't see that anymore. There used to be writers where management, like the guy who was famous was Red Fisher in Montreal, when the Canadians were winning all those Stanley Cups. He had no problem calling it like it is. Guy Lafleur, you're not getting it done. It was factually correct. Now they have a hard time doing that because you alienate that guy, he ain't going to give you any scoop, and it's going to go over there to this guy over here. So you've got this whole undercurrent here that, you know, because the emphasis is on getting information fact or fictional, and your source is often the player and the agent, that you're going to, you know, not even, you know, make stuff up and or eulogize some people just so they keep feeding you. You got this whole branding going on out there that goes, all right, so, but the people in my seat go, well, if that's not always the case, don't get me wrong. Like I got some players that are clearly both sides, great team guys and are respected by the media. But, you know, the media now is so competitive and getting scoops that you've got this whole subculture that's being created, and it's, like I say, it's happening in hockey. Like I cited the NBA here, and I could rattle off 5 in hockey like that too, so that's.
All right, Professor Sack, can you come on up here for a second? And before everyone leaves, we want to provide a couple thank you gifts.
I realized while we were out at dinner and we were debating the Vietnam War, the last book I had read on the Vietnam War was written in 1957, and it was called The Two Vietnams, and it was by Bernard Fall. A lot has happened since then. I mean, that's 30, you know, almost 50 years ago. So I thought I would give you this book. This is the most recent book. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning book. It's called Embers of War, The Fall of an Empire and the Making of America's Vietnam. I have not read this yet, but I promise I will read it, and I will see the kind of historical stuff that has come down in the last decades. And then I'm giving him a copy. Here you go. Okay. And I hope the next time we get together, we can talk on the basis of really sound data. As he was saying, it's okay to disagree, but let's see the kind of data that you have to back up your arguments. Okay? This is a little something that you can put on your desk, which has a UNH on it, and just be sure you don't tell everybody it's the University of New Hampshire. It's the University of New Haven. Okay? And there were other. This is kind of an aside, not really an aside. It is true that your father was in the Air Force for many, many years. This is a book about the heroism of many of the flyers for the United States in the Vietnam War and what they faced up against the technology of the Soviet Union and their fighter planes. And I know his father was very much involved in this, and your family may have been, but I think you may really enjoy this.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
And last but not least, we'd like to give this to Dan. This is a special tribute for being the inaugural speaker in this wonderful Alan Sack lecture series on sport and social issue. And we thank Larry for helping to put this forward. And this is all in your honor, Alan. And thank you so much, Dean, for coming all the way out here to be with us. Thank you so much.